Hello, everyone. Welcome to Our Voices, the podcast for straight partners and partners of trans people by Our Path. I'm your host, Kristen Kelbley. Before we begin today, I want to take a moment to welcome those of you listening for the first time. I know many of you are not members of our typical audience, namely straight partners of LGBT people, or as many of us simply call ourselves, straight spouses. So let me take a moment to give a brief introduction to Our Path and the Our Voices podcast. Formerly known as the Straight Spouse Network, Our Path is an all-volunteer nonprofit with a 30-year history of providing peer-to-peer support for heterosexual people who are in mixed orientation marriages to LGBT people, overwhelmingly without their knowledge. For most straight spouses in mixed orientation marriages, the disclosure or discovery that their partner is LGBT sends them on an entirely new life trajectory. An entire marriage has to be recontextualized in light of this new information. And from personal experience, I can say it is a daunting process. Our Path has been dedicated to providing individual and group support, as well as online spaces where straight spouses can share their experiences with each other. Our Path does not take a position on whether people should stay in or leave their marriages post-disclosure or discovery, but rather provides a supportive environment for the straight spouse to process their new realities and explore their options. Which brings me to the Our Voices podcast. We created this podcast 7 years ago to provide an opportunity for straight spouses to share their stories and to help those listening make sense of their relationships and adjust to their new realities. Every episode we create, including this episode, is with our core audience and their needs in mind. Now, I need to address the women we support whose husbands have come out as transgender, because this episode is focused on you. Today's interview with filmmaker Vaishnavi Sundar contains a frank discussion of the experiences of women who call themselves trans widows. We know not all of you refer to yourselves this way, but some of you do and embrace the terminology. Regardless of the preferred nomenclature, many of you will relate to the stories of the women we will be talking about today, which are real, impactful, and deserve to be amplified. Today's conversation touches on pornography, coercive control, emotional, financial, and sexual abuse that for some women correlate directly to their husbands identifying as trans. And now for the interview. Although I think I'll remind you at the top of this episode, as opposed to the end like I normally do, that the views of the host, yours truly, are not necessarily the views of Our Path or its board of directors. Now, on with the episode. Our guest today is Vaishnavi Sundar. Vaishnavi is a writer and a self-taught filmmaker from Chennai, India. Through her films, she advocates for the rights of women and girls worldwide. A decade ago, she founded Lime Soda Films with the aim of highlighting themes of social justice, women's empowerment, and education. She is the founder of Women Making Films, a platform for female filmmakers to collaborate and create works of art, and has had the privilege of hosting the work of members from more than 20 countries. Her current film, Behind the Looking Glass, delves into the lives of women whose partners have or want to transition. With voices from women worldwide, this film is the first of its kind. Welcome to the podcast, Vaishnavi. I'm excited, honored, and just sort of bowled over to have you on the show, so thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, Kristen. It's a pleasure. I mean, we've only talked briefly, but then I've been looking forward to this day myself quite a bit. So I'm very excited, just as much as you, if not more.
Well, okay, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about your documentary film, Behind the Looking Glass, which was just released, I think maybe a week or so ago on YouTube and on other platforms. And before we get too far in, why don't we talk a little bit about what that film is so our audience knows why we're having this conversation?
Sure. So before I could explain to you what the current film is about, I will have to take you through just a little bit behind the reason why I started on this project. I made another film called Dysphoric. It's a 4-part documentary on the rise of gender identity ideology, especially among young women, and how they go about dealing with this. And that happened because I got cancelled in India for speaking about the ideology and to state that women need sex segregated spaces, and it's important, especially in countries like mine and in global South in general. I got cancelled quite a bit for that. There was a screening that got pulled out of New York, and I have since been decommissioned from writing for a lot of media companies. I used to write a lot about film and feminism before. I'm not commissioned any gigs anymore. So I made Dysphoric just to understand what's going on. It started with just a curiosity project, and then it just became into this giant film that had to be made into 4 parts. And I did it all through the COVID lockdown. Now, when I was making Dysphoric, at the back of my mind, there was this constant thought about the people that I was talking to, interviewing for the film. They would constantly mention their partners or their loved ones and things like that. At that time, I wasn't paying too much attention to it, but I suppose something just stayed in my brain a little bit as to what must be going on in the minds of the family members, loved ones, the partners, and things like that. So that kind of stayed on. And once Dysphoric got over, and a lot of people wrote to me about their experiences watching the film, and how it, mothers writing to me about how that helped them have their daughters come away from the ideology, pursuing this whole identity and things like that. There were a couple of emails from trans widows themselves. Back then, I didn't know what the terminology meant. Trans widows basically is just a collective term that the women have chosen to use for themselves. These women whose partners have transitioned. And worldwide, this seems to be a common terminology that seems to bring a lot of women together. So I didn't know this terminology then, but then when a couple of them wrote to me, this idea that was in the back of my mind during Dysphoric was just, right at the front of my mind then. And I started exploring the possibility of what would be going on in the minds of especially women. Because by then I had become quite hardline after Dysphoric. I used to still have some doubts. I used to think that, maybe for some people it's all right, for some people it's not all right. But having done my research and having understood the extent of this ideology, I'm now quite, ultra, as they call it on Twitter. So while I was talking to these women, I knew for a fact that I had to center women in this whole thing. It wasn't about men, because other men can make that film. But for me, it's the women. So I was always thinking about what's going on in the minds of women whose partners who are either women or men who transition. But then, unfortunately, I couldn't talk to enough women whose partners were female, as in lesbian partners. I couldn't talk to a lot of them. I spoke to about 6 or 7 of them, but I also realized that the motivation behind these women transitioning and the motivation behind the men transitioning were completely different. And I didn't want it to be just like one little addendum in the film about pornography and fetishes and all of those things, because it's a completely different issue altogether, and it warrants a separate film and separate sensitivity to it altogether. So then I started researching. At the time, I didn't realize there would be enough interest, because this is such a taboo subject to talk about, because there was not enough stuff online to read about. There were a few websites. Everybody was writing anonymously. There was such a hush-hush around it. And I thought women would just absolutely not be ready to talk about this yet, maybe in 5 years or something. So I was just still pursuing it as a research interest, out of curiosity. And then I was proven very wrong, because I sent out a little pamphlet asking if women will be interested to share their stories. Their anonymity was guaranteed. They were just going to chat with me. It wasn't going to be recorded and things like that. I was bowled over by how many women got in touch with me. And I realized this is a treasure trove. This is like this untouched territory within the whole ideology, gender identity ideology, that nobody has talked about yet. And the women have been desperate, because they just were waiting. Wouldn't anybody ask me about my experience? I think that's how it all began for me. And I started talking to one woman, and then more women, and then more women. And then I ended up talking to nearly 50 women. All of them couldn't be in the film, of course, but for research purposes, I spoke to quite a lot of them. And yeah, that's the origin story of Behind the Looking Glass.
Okay, thank you for that background and context. As you're listening to these stories of women whose husbands, partners, male partners have come out and said, I'm transgender or I want to transition, what kind of made you decide which stories to select for the documentary? Was there a particular theme that you noticed coming forward in their stories that made them right for the film, the ones that made it into the film?
In the early stages, I wasn't making any such calls at all. I was just trying to just consume them, just absorb them, and to a point where I just knew the name and the story almost instinctively. I just knew this woman went through this experience. So I was just basically just absorbing everything. And then there came the point of, logistics, whether, even though these women shared their story with me, whether it would be safe for them to speak about this in the film. So quite a lot of them couldn't participate in the final film, even though they shared their experience, which was very, very valuable. Of course, quite a lot of things got revealed by having that conversation with them, which sort of shaped my decision on how the narrative is going to be, even though they weren't in the film. So that's quite a lot of people who couldn't be part of the film. And then there were others who were part of the film, but then they couldn't be public about their experience. So out of the 18 women that eventually were, I wouldn't say they were chosen. They were the ones that were finally ready. I spoke to quite a lot of them. There were 18 women who were ready. Even until the very last minute, there were a lot of cancellations, which I perfectly understand. I can't even imagine the horror they must be feeling inside their mind, whether, their ex-husband will catch them in the act or whether they will be found out. Even if I promise anonymity, there is no guarantee, right? The film will be out. I'll go on and live my life, but it is their story and their safety was like absolute pivotal importance to me. So then these 18 women eventually were finalized. After I started working on the project, like putting their stories together and trying to come up with a narrative, there were still more women who got in touch with me. At that time, I had to say no, unfortunately, because it was bad. It was hard enough for me to animate 8 characters from scratch and then, just to go ahead and make the film in totality. So then, unfortunately, I had to say no to a lot of people when I was sort of midway in the project. But if this were like a continuous project, for example, a commission project where I can like spend my whole life collecting these stories, I bet there will be thousands of such stories. I am sure of it. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, you could probably spend your entire life telling these stories. And just for the audience who haven't seen the film yet, the women's stories are each told through animated characters. It's a really neat way to tell the story. I want to take a moment, since you talked about some women who canceled on being able to tell their story and maybe didn't feel entirely safe. I think we need to talk about some of these suppressive forces on women, because it sounds like they come from a couple different directions. It sounds like that there might be some threat, implicit or explicit, from a spouse or partner if you talk about this, or it's not safe for me to talk about this. And then there are some external pressures outside of the relationship culturally. So let's just talk about a few things really quick about what would keep a woman from being public, being able to fully come out and tell her story, use her name, use her face, that sort of thing.
I suppose a large majority of them are mostly just worried for their kids. I can just straight out say that, because they are just being protective of their children, both in terms of if the partner found out, what would happen. That's fear number one. And fear number two, if he is public, what would be the ramifications of the children if, say, in school, the other kids or the other kids' parents find out that this is the experience of this boy's mother, and how would the experience of that child be in school after that? So there were like all of these fundamental things associated with kids that were like the most basic reason why they chose anonymity. And secondly, it's just the traditional patriarchal fear of a male member. It's just, would he abuse me? Would he hit me? Would he dox me? Would he take away the custody of children from me? Would he not pay me financial support to take care of the children? Because she probably had babies when she was, soon after she got married, and she never could go and be financially independent. So she's dependent on him for all this money and taking care of the children and things like that. So she's also worried about that. So this is directly and indirectly affecting the children. And when it comes to herself, she's basically just this primal fear. And I can't stress this enough. This primal fear of potential abuse, physical, sexual, and the degree of violence could vary in different cases. This one particular trans widow spoke to from Belgium, she couldn't be in the film in the end. I think he kind of had a suspicion while she was having a conversation with us for research purposes itself. So she had to cancel a few times and things like that. So these are like actual real fear, whether they would just show up in their house and hit them, whether take the children away, whether they will cut financial support and things like that. So all those different reasons are why. And also, I think women were also have trying to have a normal life in a society. Let's say, for example, this whole thing happened in a particular city and they moved to a different city now, and in that city they're trying to move away from all these horrible things in the past. Now they don't want their face associated to that experience in this new city, so they want to start anew, so they can't talk about that in this new place. And I can completely understand that. It's like, all these things happened to me that was in the past. I can talk about it, but I don't want that to carry on or linger around with me in the current moment, because my life is not that anymore. So these are like, there's so many different reasons why I imagine women were finding it difficult to speak publicly about it. As an addition to the things that would stop women from speaking out about it is the dangers of abuse afterwards. So, for example, they are watching things unravel in front of their eyes, right? So there are women like me who are already public, who are getting bullied and harassed and all of these things online. They can see that, and they know that the reason why they're being attacked is because I'm speaking publicly about it. So activists are very, very clear in letting you know what your place is. If you speak out against this, this is what I'm going to do, is what they say. So when women witness other women go through this, they will have second thoughts about putting themselves through the trauma after having just come away from something so traumatic as their whole life. So I imagine that would also be one of the very strong reasons why women would be hesitant to talk about this.
We see that in our own support groups, et cetera. A lot of people are grappling with various issues of, okay, I can't be public because I want to protect my children. I want to make sure that there's no ramifications for them and socially and in school. But also, I don't want to speak out about my experience publicly too much because people come back at me with questions like, well, you're not responding correctly. I think one of the things, Shannon Thrace, we interviewed her on this show too, and she was also in your film momentarily. She said that, that people are very quick to question in this particular circumstance whether or not you respond to your spouse coming out as trans correctly. And so the women are not allowed to have the full range of emotion and experience connected with a spouse coming out as trans. There are a few experiences, I think, interrelational experiences that are so disorienting. And my husband was only gay, and it was a mind fuck. so I when I first met my first woman, a trans widow is how she called herself, and I was listening to her story, and I went, "What is this? This is orders of magnitude more disorienting than my marriage." And my marriage was profoundly disorienting. So these women feel like they can't really speak to the fullness of their experience. So, okay, let's talk about that. All right, let's talk about these women's experiences, because that's what the film is about. And these women coming forward and saying, this is what happened to me. This is what it was like. This is what I endured. This is what I experienced. So what are some of the threads that run through these women's stories?
As far as the common threads go, in terms of, just the shock of having found something like this out about their husband, and to thereafter try and see if something can be done to work things out with this person, because after all, they did love them and they married them because they were in love with them and they wanted to spend their life with them. Every single woman who spoke in our film did say to me that she tried really hard to see if things can be worked out, even though she needn't have. There was not a single reason why she had to put up with any form of abuse. It doesn't even matter the extent, it doesn't matter whether it's verbal, sexual, physical, it didn't matter. She needn't have stayed. But all of them invariably tried to see if they can work things out. Of course, there are other reasons as well. They might be financially dependent on them. They might have children with these men and things like that. Other revelations for me were, once these men found out that the wives are now aware of this, the way they were dealing with it, up until then it was a secret, right? Right after that, it became entitlement. it became about, oh, well, now I don't have to really hide or, don't have to walk around eggshells about this whole thing. Now that I'm going to just, parade around the house in my female clothing. And the whole intimate aspect of a marriage between a man and a woman in this context, in our film's context, is just completely taken over by this ideology. And these women share their experience of how there isn't a single aspect of their life that isn't affected by this. And gradually, what happens is their whole life becomes about this man's ideology. There isn't any personal interest that she could, nurture and pursue. She is given the complete responsibility of taking care of the children because the man is just busy parading around in his female clothes. And a lot of them are just so disturbed mentally at how these men are trying to imitate those wives. It's like these women are asked to perform this sort of a femininity that these men want to embody. And I can't even imagine what it feels like to have your husband say to you, can you just tell me how to walk? How do you walk like that? I want to walk like you. How do you do that? Can you teach me that? I can't even imagine the trauma that goes behind, all of these things.
Vaishnavi, can I just take a moment on that? We see in our support groups and in our online groups women talking about these various things. When it comes to trying to stay, I see women really agonizing over their role in supporting their spouse. They want to be a supportive spouse. They want to try and stay. They want to keep their family together. This is the man I loved, that I thought was going to be with for the rest of my life. Also, if I'm a good wife, what that means is that I support him. What that means is that I try to be empathetic and understanding. And sometimes it seems like, and I think this was in your film, some of these women get lost in that role. I mean, if all of the oxygen gets sucked out of the room for the husband's transition, there's no oxygen left for her to breathe. And then she is kind of reduced to the role of sort of his human support animal. And it's interesting to watch these women come to conclusions at various points in their trajectory that, like, I don't have to do that anymore. But I agree. We see that over here too, is what I'm saying, is that there's definitely a period of time where it's like, how do I support him best? And then also the financial aspect. Like, I stayed home for 20 years and raised the kids. Like, if we divorce, where do I go? What do I do? What kind of career do I get? What kind of work? What kind of money can I make? So I just want to say that we see those kinds of things too. So yeah, it tracks.
And the reason why they are unable to move on from that point, is also because she is completely isolated from her support system as well, right? Because of his transgender identity hovering over her like a dark cloud constantly, she is not feeling encouraged to go and talk about this to her friends or to her family, for example, because she just stops going and meeting her friends. She just stops doing things for herself. If she was going to say, I don't know, some Zumba class, she just stops going there because everybody talks about their family. She has to say something, but she doesn't have anything to say, and she doesn't want to talk about this thing. So she just does not go anymore. Or this man would say something like, why do you want to do all of that? Why don't you just stay home and like take care of the kids? Because I need to go outside and go to this gay bar or, this trans bar, and, I have to live my life. You have, because of this marriage, I had to forgo all of these years of my, self-exploration. So why don't you just sit in the house while I go and, do this thing for myself? A lot of these things have happened to these women where their support system have been completely cut off, voluntarily and involuntarily sometimes. And that's also another reason why it feels as though they don't have a choice but to be a support human, because there is nowhere else to go.
There's something you said a little bit earlier too about the husbands asking the wives for sort of tips or pointers on how to perform femininity. So it's not uncommon for us to see someone make a post or something and say, he's wearing a wig that looks like my hair. Or going to the store and buying the same dress that I have, but just in a size that fits him. That there's this sense of mimicry that isn't really flattering. It's actually quite disturbing, and they don't necessarily know how to process that, and they're not allowed to say that out loud.
No, they're not allowed to say that out loud at all. And if we notice this to be mimicry, which it is, we should also understand that these men do this not because they think that their wives are beautiful or they think that this identity, this female identity, is something that they are really proud of or something like that. For a large majority of them, if not all of them, the feeling of being or identifying as a woman comes from a point of depravity where it touches upon pornography, it touches upon so many other different aspects of it, where they consider women to be subhuman. And juxtapose that with these men wanting to mimic their wives. It's like saying, you are the most subhuman there is, and I'm going to just imitate you. That is not that is going to hurt me so much, let alone the very obvious hurts that these men put their wives through. This is another layer if you start thinking about it like that. If a man is pursuing this identity because to him it feels humiliating to be a woman and therefore he wants to do it, what does it say about these men who want to humiliate themselves by imitating their own wives? I can't even imagine the layers of trauma that these women are going through.
I think we should give a little bit of context about the film in this particular moment, because we're going to go here and have this conversation around pornography, etc. And that is fairly close to the opening of the film. There's a montage of men dressed in female clothing, self-evidently for sexual purposes. It is a montage that one must see, and then once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. But once you see it, you can't see anything else. And it becomes very evident that I'm sure there are people listening who are going, not all, okay. And at the same time, many are doing it for these purposes. And we cannot ignore that. So when we see this montage, if people are listening, haven't seen the film yet, and you see this opening montage, it's maybe, I don't know, it's 10 minutes into the film or 5 minutes into the film, it's pretty close. It lays the groundwork and context for this entire discussion that you and I are having, Vaishnavi, right now, in relation to what these women are experiencing. Some women may not report that they've experienced their husbands in this kind of capacity, but a lot do. And this is a part of many women's experience, the adjacency to pornography of their husbands' behaviors and the way their husbands dress post-transition or during transition. And that has to be talked about. That's the thing that I think for me is the most whispered about thing that you just don't go there and you just don't say. And what your film does is put it right on the table. And when it's on the table, you can't ignore it anymore. So let's go ahead and talk about that, because for these women in this film, there are definitely sexual dynamics, both in their partner's interests in dressing as a woman or living as a woman, however he conceives it, and in what the wives are asked to do and participate in. And that, to me, was some of the most traumatic stuff, which is what is being asked in the bedroom. I remember one quote from one of the wives in the film. Her husband had said something to her like, I'm the woman now and you're a man. Like he wanted a complete reversal of the roles in the bedroom. And wow. Another woman talked about the pressure to participate in her husband's sexual behaviors or interests. And I believe her quote was something like, if you don't do it, you're frozen out if you don't do what he wants. And there's no compromise and not much concern about consent. So I think we can't deny that this aspect accompanies many of these kinds of marriages.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you. For any ideology to present itself as stunning and brave, right? You always see some of the best faces, some of the best stories, some of the most glorified champion stories where there are these men who don't look like, say, the men in the montage, who are just ordinarily dressed. And then there is this wife who's standing beside him, dead in the eyes, but that's just because we know it, we can recognize it, but she's just standing there supportive to him, smiling, calling herself a lesbian woman now, and writing columns in newspapers, blogs, and all of those things where she is considered to be the champion of his ideology. Now any ideology would want to present that as the face of the whole movement. But that's not always the truth, because when you uncover that little initial cream stage of it, and when you go deep into the burrow, is when you really see the dark side of things. And that's where the whole pornography exists. The whole intention behind wanting to transition because of pornography exists. There's an entire genre of pornography called sissification hypnosis, which we talk about in the film as well. Genevieve, who's done extensive research on the topic, has written extensively on her blog and in Redux and things like that, has been voicing out this horror show for so many years. But the mainstream media never picks it up because it's not this beautiful story with with an ordinary person wearing, I don't know, ordinary clothes with his wife standing next to him. You don't see these horror shows at all. But I think it's important to lay both of these things side by side, because what they do is they deny the existence of men like the ones that we see in the film, but we know they exist. Like, even if you are somebody who is saying, trans women are women, you want to champion all trans identities, non-binary identities, whatever, aren't you just even so, just a little bit concerned about these men who are also claiming to be part of the same ideology, but are stemming from their motives are all stemming from very depraved, absolutely grotesque pornography? It's your movement. Aren't you going to say something about that?
Right.
But they want
The
that.
lines have been blurred and conflated, between a 14-year-old girl, let's say, and this podcast is not necessarily about that particular topic, but let's just make the point that a 14-year-old girl who has gender distress, who is uncomfortable in this hypersexualized environment that we're in, being a female, and chooses to identify as a trans boy as a way of opting out of that, is conflated with an adult male who is clearly, you can see in the pictures in the montage on your film, is clearly dressing as a woman for sexual interests and reasons. And the lines between those two things have been blurred intentionally. And so when we go and look at this, though, you cannot unsee it. And I agree with you. Like, we have to get a little bit curious about this, because where my interest is that women are experiencing the impacts of this every day, showing up in support groups, calling, saying, how do I get some help? We've even had a lesbian or two call us and say, my partner is transitioning. I can't get help anywhere else. So, and I think the other point that you made about the face of the movement, as someone who just had a gay husband and is in community with a lot of people who've had men who have had a lesbian wife, or women who've had a gay husband, et cetera, it can really be irritating and frustrating when you turn on Good Morning America and there's the story of like, oh, he came out as gay and now they're best friends, and we go shopping together. It's always the rainbow pride family, like super happy version of the story. When I know on the back end, there is a lot of psychological fallout for the straight spouse in experiences like this, even if you get to a place where you're good and friends at the end. But that doesn't even account for the relationships where so much psychological damage has been done in the wake. And that's not even this level of psychological disorientation that these particular women experience. And so I just have to say, like, I relate to that. And now I have to laugh at my own peak and frustration at watching Good Morning America. Oh, here's another story about how everything ended up wonderful and now they're besties, right? This is next level.
It is. I mean, can you imagine this has been going on for years now, from the 60s, from the 70s, where these men have been glorified as cross-dressing, transvestite, transsexuals, whatever. The names might have changed. It's all the same shit show anyway. But can you imagine in 2024 is when we finally have a single film that talks about the experience of wives that are not in favor of these men. I'm flabbergasted most of the time while I'm editing this film. How in the world was nobody, even out of idle curiosity, interested in what these women have had to say all these years? Now, in our film, we've had women who is 70 years old now, and these things happened to her when she was in her 20s. And we have women who are 20 years something old now, and these things are happening to her. Can you imagine the magnitude of suppression of their voices Where in 2024, finally, there is like one film that maybe, like, I don't know, maybe we got lucky with the views with this film in this case. But, when a woman makes a film about domestic violence or violence against women, right? It's the same old boring story. Women are the most boring victims. Women are constantly whining about the abuse that they're facing in the hands of their abusive husbands. Nobody talks about the fact that it has been going on for so long and therefore we're talking about it. They just don't want to listen to this. It's just become boring now. And with the trans layer added to this, now it's not just boring, it's like taboo. You're an evil person if you complain about your husband's trans identity, because how dare you make this about yourself?
Yeah, it's not all about you.
But you wonder then, what is about her? Just what is?
Right. Right.
This isn't about her. Her own abuse story isn't about her.
Her own marriage isn't about her. Her own life isn't about her. Yeah.
Her own body isn't hers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because it's been torn apart and worn by these men. To the hair, to the detail of the hair. So what is it that is about her then? What is it that women are allowed to talk about in this ideology, or for that matter in the garden variety misogyny? What is it that we can actually openly talk about? Nothing. I fear nothing.
Vaishnavi, one of the things that I find interesting as somebody who works on this side of supporting other straight people who have LGBT spouses is that overwhelmingly, almost 99.99% of people who come across our doors with a trans partner are women. In fact, I only know of one man whose wife transitioned to a trans man, but it's overwhelmingly women whose husbands are coming out. And no one really seems to have a good answer for this. And I think, our interviews with Dr. Blanchard, Phil Illey, Ray Alex Williams, however people take their agree or don't agree with what they have to say, point to obviously autogynephilia. But what's interesting to me is we interviewed a therapist on this show a couple seasons back, and for the life of me in this moment, I can't remember his name. And I asked him that question because he deals with couples, men, women and men husbands who come out as trans, and he sees them in their office and he very much supports them in staying together. And I asked him why he doesn't see the opposite version of the couple in his therapy office. Why aren't there men showing up with wives who are transitioning to trans men? And just trying to see what he might say as an answer. And his answer was something to the effect of, well, men are slower to seek help, so they might not come across our doors. And I'm going, really? That's the explanation, that there's not something else that points to the fact that men overwhelmingly have more non-standard sexual interests than women. And also women are socialized to be accommodating. So you put those two things together and you have a recipe for overwhelmingly more women coming across therapist thresholds with trans-identified husbands, and that non-standard sexual interest is a big part of that. So I just think that's an interesting discrepancy that very few people seem to be willing to address or be able to comment on.
And if you really think about it, it's rewarding to come out as trans in this time and age, right? And a large majority of women that choose a trans identity, like you briefly mentioned at the beginning, they do it because they want to hide away their femininity. They want to hide themselves. And that's why they are not the flamboyant, oh, look at me, this glorious and stunning trans person that I am. No, they usually just, find their own little corner on the internet. You never see the popular ones. The popular ones are always male to female transitioning ones. You never see the female to male transitioning ones as the face of the movement. And it is rewarding now to come out as transition whatever person. And the fact that pornography and prostitution and surrogacy and all those sexual abusive aspects of female is now considered to be okay, as part of a feminist revolution somehow. These men are given even more motivation, even more impetus to come outside and talk about this, because they will then be given the social capital they probably didn't have as white male. But I can for sure speculate that women hide away when they transition, men announce it to the world.
Hey everyone, this is the moment in the show where I pause to do the thing every content creator hates to do but has to do, and that is ask for your support. We incur costs associated with producing, engineering, and editing this podcast, as well as keeping the lights on and paying the bills to run Our Path. Your financial support means a lot to us and to the straight partners and partners of trans people we support. You can go to ourpath.org and click on Give Support in the menu, and then become a donor. If financial support is not in your budget, you can become a volunteer with Our Path. Our Path is seeking board members, volunteer support contacts, and staff members. Again, you can find all of this information under Give Support at ourpath.org. I want to talk about something that I know the women that we support are experiencing, and that is the pressure or invitation, depending on what angle you're coming from, to reconceptualize your own sexual identity and sexual orientation in light of your husband coming out as trans. So one of the women in your film says that her husband tried to say that she was a closeted bisexual, like just foisting a sexual orientation and an identity on another person. I know a lot of women have had to ask, can I consider myself a lesbian? Or do I have to consider myself a lesbian to stay in this relationship? If I stay in this relationship, does that mean I'm a lesbian? What if I've never been attracted to women before, sexually or romantically? What if I can't remain attracted to my husband if he transitioned? The fallout for her sex life, the fallout for her sense of safety, it's twofold. It's both how she conceives of herself sexually in terms of who she's attracted to, what she's interested in, but then also, does she get to have the sexual relationship that she wants with a partner?
This is the most confounding aspect of the ideology. They say that you are who you say you are, and there is no questions asked. But how is it that a straight woman should suddenly call herself a lesbian when she is not what she is? When she's not that, when she's not a lesbian, how come she doesn't get to say, I am who I say I am? I'm a straight woman who was married to a man who's now wearing frilly frock. Why can't she just say that? The hypocrisy and the cognitive dissonance in the way these people place their arguments sometimes makes me laugh, because if you can't laugh, what can you do in this ideology, right? The fact that these men say that, well, actually, you might just be a lesbian, you never know because you're married to me, because if I have always been a woman inside, then if you have fallen in love with me, then maybe you are indeed bisexual because you're now married to me and I'm a woman. This just the layers of confusion in this whole thing is just really ridiculous. And this isn't just anybody saying it in an intimate relationship. These are things that are said by the man who's employed by Edinburgh Rape Crisis Center. He said you have to reconceptualize your sexual trauma in order to fit in the fact that there will now be men with penises, which were used by some of them to rape these women, to just put up with the fact that they will now have to coexist in the same space. So this isn't just individual men saying it to individual women. This is across the board. There are people in positions of power who are asking to reconceptualize. So it is the law that you don't question a trans-identified person because they are who they say they are. But that rule is only applicable to them. If you say that, they will start ridiculing you. They will. This whole palace of illusion just falls apart.
It's so interesting to me because I don't think people understand too. I think they think it's a little ask, just go ahead and reconceptualize your sexual identity, right? Like somehow there's this dismissal that there's a tremendous amount of psychological upheaval in that one ask. I remember one of the first women I spoke to, she said, if he was always a she, was there ever really an us? Because she's going, I'm heterosexual, I married a man, I would only marry a man, I would not have married a woman because I'm not gay, I'm not a lesbian. The ground underneath your feet psychologically is suddenly destabilized. And it's not just in that area then. It's in other areas as well. The impact of having a spouse who is not who or what you thought they were, whether they're gay, lesbian, bisexual, the moment you discover material information about your spouse that you didn't know, everything becomes questionable. Your whole life and history with this person. Was I living a real relationship? Was what we were doing true and authentic and real? Can I believe in my past? And if I'm unmoored from my past, how do I build a coherent future from here if what I thought I got into in terms of a marriage was not actually what I really got into? Like, it has these whole ramifications, this domino effect down the road. And then afterwards you have to spend a lot of time, like years, reconstructing your own psychological coherence after something like this. So people just don't, they think it's a little ask. Oh, just think of yourself as lesbian, or oh, just think of yourself in this way. Oh, it's not about you. Like, make sure that your focus is in the proper place. And what I've stood for on this podcast and our path is that 100% of your life experience is about you. And so, you get to have your own life. You get to have your own experience of mixed orientation marriage, of your spouse coming out. However, it's that ask that you don't get to have that you have to subsume yourself in your own life is, it's so many bridges too far.
No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's not even just inappropriate. That in itself is a level of denial of someone else's humanity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But it is only the woman's humanity that we are allowed to deny, never the man's,
Right. Right.
And also,
Yeah.
it isn't just the man saying, it's just a tiny ask where he's now dressed up as a woman and he is thinking that he is now with a woman because he is now a lesbian. So that's just still within the bedrooms, and it is confounding in itself. We're talking about the degree of manipulation here and gaslighting. We're talking about therapists saying the same thing. We're talking about doctors saying the same thing. We're talking about other friends in the society, the places of work and schools and other where these women would meet other women. They're all saying the same thing. Or it becomes one of those things where it's just too weird and you don't know what to say. So you'd rather not say anything at all because she's the weird one who's got a husband who's now saying he's a woman now. So I just don't want to I'll probably cross the road and go that way. There are people avoiding their close friends because of this situation. And if this is how they're going to behave, why would she feel confident enough to open up to somebody and to seek help, right? Therapists are saying the same thing, friends are saying the same thing, parents are saying the same thing. Parents are saying something slightly different because in some cases, at least in countries where things are a bit more prevalent, probably, unfortunately, maybe even older generation people can get a sense of what it is that their daughter is talking about. Let's say a country like mine. Now, if I were to say that I used to be married, I'm not anymore. If I were to say to my parents, he's now saying he's a woman, my parents would be probably laughing for some time, and then they'll be like, what is this joke? They can't understand. What do you mean he's a woman? What do you mean by that? They can't wrap their head around this idea. Now this is pretty much more than half of the world right now, and these are all the countries where this ideology is very, very taking over in terms of the media houses and the law and everything. These are the countries where people are kind of putting their very strong foot down. In my country, you're now allowed to get a divorce if your husband has chosen to get a sex change. I'm quoting, air quoting, sex change surgery. But that's not because the court is worried about the well-being of the woman. No, they don't understand the concept of trans widow. They don't understand the concept of what it is like to be in an abusive relationship with a trans addendum to this. The court is granting her a divorce because the court believes a marriage is between a man and a woman. So they acknowledge that the husband is now a woman. Therefore, this marriage is void. You see the layers of cluster
Right.
mind mapping that is going on over in countries like this.
I think we have to talk about that these women in your film have experienced coercive control as an aspect of their partner coming out as trans, that they are correlated, intimately related in the wife's experience, the coercive control alongside with the spouse coming out as trans. And while we recognize that not every woman listening to this is going to recognize that as part of her experience, and that is fine because we honor your experience as a wife and as a woman, for many women, coercive control is part of this experience. And I think we do those women a disservice by not acknowledging it, by not allowing them to say, this was part of my experience, and by not listening to them. So can you talk about what coercive control looked like for some of the women in your film?
Yeah, coercive control is one of the most effective tools I've realized, having spoken with all these women. In many cases, they're not coercing them sexually, they're not violent towards them, they don't even so much as yell at them or speak in a loud volume or something like that. They've always been this very calm, silent, quiet type of men who get away with things by controlling them in this mental gaslighting manner, where they make you feel like you're constantly dependent on the men at all times, and they make you feel inferior if you don't do what the man is asking you to do. So you're constantly just trying to do better, do all the things that he's asking you to do, so that he thinks that you're good enough for him, so that he thinks you're a good enough mother, so that he thinks you're a good enough wife, and things like that. So coercive control can be used in so many different contexts. It could be to sexually coerce her, it could be to get custody of the children from her, or it could be just to be quiet and just affirm him for the rest of his life. Many women are still held up in marriages like this because they they have been groomed into thinking that there is no life outside for her without him, because he is the one man who understands her so perfectly. He's the one man who has given her all this this grand life, and therefore she should forever be grateful to him. And the way she has to be grateful to him is just putting up with every transgressions that he is subjecting her to. She's not allowed to talk about it anywhere, because that's not who he really is. He really is. Now, these wives start making excuses for those men. That's how coercive control comes to play. These men, they will probably want something from her, and she doesn't want to do it. But she justifies it to herself by saying, well, actually, he's a really nice guy. Otherwise, maybe he's just in a bad mood. So I'm just going to go ahead and do it, because otherwise he gets really cranky. That's the first misstep. That might be the tiniest of thing that would be the start of all the things that you might ask her to do, that she would have to justify to herself, that otherwise she'll go mad, right? How can she willfully do something that she doesn't want to do if she does not justify it to herself that it is actually quite a nice thing to do? Doing it for his well-being. He's your husband. You love him. La la la. When I used to be married, and this guy that I was married to was considered to be the most amazing guy. Everybody thought what a catch, that sort of a thing. Oh, he's so smart. He's so kind. He loves her. La la la. I know that the 6 years that I spent with him, and 10 years ago when the marriage ended, I got married really young. I stayed married for about 6 years. If he hadn't made the decision to leave, or if he hadn't made the decision to get a divorce, I wouldn't be allowed to. I wouldn't have been allowed to do that by myself based on my own thoughts and feelings and experiences. I could get away from it because he wanted away. And to this day, it is the one thing that I'm so grateful for, because he wanted away. If he hadn't gone, I would have still been married to him, just doing all of these things, cleaning up the dirty laundry after him. I can't even imagine the degree of control that the men with trans identity would have on these women, because it's not just the men, it's the immediate friend circle, and then it's the therapy and the support groups that constantly tell her that she should put up with it. And then that's a society at large. They see what's happening to J.K. Rowling. Now, if something like that can happen to J.K. Rowling, who am I? Who's going to listen to my poor voice? That's the degree of control that these men have created. It's like a huge Himalayan control that it feels like we can't even induce a crack in it, let alone break it apart. We can't do anything about it anymore.
Yeah. Women like J.K. Rowling and several others are drawing fire. And I don't know, I almost don't have words for my level of admiration for that kind of courage. So, Vaishnavi, we're close to time, and knowing that there are going to be other people listening to this episode who are not straight spouses or trans widows or are shorthand for ourselves. But for those women who are listening, who call themselves straight spouses or call themselves trans widows or reject that terminology and call them something else, but the common thread is that they're here at Our Path listening to the Our Voices podcast in our support spaces because this is happening to them. If you could leave them with a couple of thoughts that might be helpful to them or inspiring for them in their situation, what would you offer them?
Oh gosh, I mean, I could hug them all, I could just hug them and tell them that it'll get better. That's the first thing I want to say. It feels like it's absolute bottom of the barrel, end of life kind of darkness when you're in it. I can empathize because I have been there, not necessarily with the trans association, but I have been there and I know how dark it is. The more you try to get up, the more it feels like somebody's just punching you deeper and deeper and deeper. But it will get better. And our film is a testimony to that. Our film is a proof, a living proof of all of these women who have come away from it. Even if they haven't come away from it, at least they're able to identify that what is happening to them is abuse. They're able to name it for what it is. They're not just in denial to say that, oh, he is a very nice guy. He just has temper tantrums. It's not that anymore. He is abusing me. There is such clarity of thought in their minds. I think the first step for us when we are in that really dark abyss is to acknowledge to ourselves that we are not feeling okay right now. We don't have to convince ourselves that it's fine, everything will be fine. I'm just going to get up and pack my lunch and get the kids to school and I'm just going to get on with my day. Everything's going to be better. It will not. We've got to first acknowledge that this is dark and you're going through something profoundly difficult and acknowledge to yourself that it is happening to you. That's first step. The second step is to also tell yourself through so many different ways, whatever is suitable, whatever is possible for these women, to look around us to find support in that sense, So these women, when it all happened to them, especially the ones that are about 70-ish now, can you imagine how it must have been for them about 50 years ago when there was, all of these things are unheard of. Now we have support groups like Our Path who can, hold their hands and talk to them and listen to them. Well, they didn't have all of that back then. So if they have come away from it and 50 years down the line, if they're able to give you a message of hope saying that things can get better, I think I'll hold on to that like a glue, I'll hold on to that for my life depends on it, And I think all these women who are presently in the situation should know that they are important. They are the most important thing in the world first, because if they aren't going to take care of themselves, the children are not going to be taken care of either. So if she doesn't think for herself, maybe she should think for her children and think that I need to be okay so that I can make sure that my children are okay. And believe somehow, that it might seem as if it is the end of life, but she should believe that she has the strength in her to be able to come away from it. If that's what she wants, if that's what the right path is for her, she should believe that she has that strength, because most of the time all this coercive control and isolation, what it does to you is make you believe that you're incapable of standing up for yourself. That's what they break you into, that's what they break from you, or rather that's what they take away from you, where they don't want you to think that you are a fully thinking being who can,
being with agency,
yes, exactly,
and autonomy,
absolutely,
and sovereignty. Yes,
they take that away from you. So it will take you a minute to tell yourself that that's not lost. It's all there in you. You're all of that, and you're better. You're better than whatever it is that this man is asking you or telling you you are. You are better than that. And if coming away, now I think in the current times where we have support groups like yours and in extension all these women who are holding these individual groups in local cities and things like that, now is the best time for you to seek support. Now is the best time for you to come away from it, because people understand abuse. Maybe not all of the world, but some of us do. And if she can reach out to us, nothing like it, because we are going to hold her hand and pull her out of that.
It's such a beautiful and hopeful note to end on. Thank you so much, Vaishnavi, for this conversation. I want to, before we close, I want to, first of all, Thank you for including the Our Voices podcast in your film. People may not know, but the audio clips of Dr. Ray Blanchard talking about autogynephilia at the beginning of the show came from this podcast. So we're proud and happy to be part of this important film, even just in little slivers. And then we want to tell people where they can find you. Of course, we'll include a link to the documentary in the show notes if you are prepared to watch. We recognize not every woman would be in the place at this particular moment to watch. But it'll be there for you if you need it. But it's been shadow banned. Can you talk a little bit about that?
But it doesn't surprise us anymore, right?
No.
Not only it's shadow banned, as in when you search for the documentary, it's not showing up as the first hit. Even though that's the name of the whole film, it's not showing up. All these other videos are showing up, but not our film. And also, YouTube's told us that they're not going to allow us to gain any ad revenues from it. We have 100,000 views right now. That would have amounted to quite a lot of ad revenue. We weren't given a single penny from that. And I hear from people who are watching it who don't have a premium, which means they'll watch it with ads. They're telling me they're watching it with some pro-gender ads. And that's the most infuriating thing for me. We're talking about like literally the opposite of what they're advertising, and they're making money out of it. But then I'm thinking we're going to weigh our pros and cons here, right?
Right.
About having a film out with so many subtitles. So many, like 6 now and more coming. I mean, this has never happened. This is historic. So between that and trying to fight with, a YouTube giant, I chose to not be bothered about being demonetized or being shadow banned. Whoever needs the link, women have been like in the front. Anybody needs the link, they are giving them. Many times I go to bed and wake up and somebody would have asked me a query, it would have already been answered. Women have just been like there, It's like they were waiting for a resource like this. And now that they have it, it's like an ammunition for them and they're just like using it everywhere. I'm not a big fan of war. I didn't mean to have like a war metaphor here, but you understand what I'm saying. It's like a tool now. They're using this as a tool to reach out.
Yeah. Well, I know women in our communities have already started watching it because there's a little bit of a hum and a little buzz going around about it. So we're certainly aware. And as I mentioned, we'll put links to the film in the show notes and then also to Lime Soda Films. And then you're also all over social media, Facebook, Twitter, X, probably Instagram, all the things, I assume.
Yes.
Okay, great. So we'll put you there. I feel like there's so much more that could be said beyond just an hour, but I'm just grateful that you came on for the women who are going through this. And that's who we're here for. The women who are going through this so that they can be seen, be acknowledged, and know that they're not alone. Thank you.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a fantastic conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in today, both those who have been listening for a long time, and if you're new to us today, thanks for tuning in. Be on the lookout for all new episodes as they drop, usually on the first of the month, if I can get myself on a proper schedule. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. You can find us wherever you get yours. And this is a friendly reminder that the views of the host, yours truly, are not necessarily the views of Our Path or its board of directors. And until next time, this is Kristen reminding you, keep using your voice.